You spent your entire life protecting, teaching, providing. You fed dreams, corrected mistakes, held trembling hands through moments of fear. And now, standing before your grown child, you still feel the same impulse to help. But what happens when that help is no longer an act of love and quietly becomes a trap? Freud would not mince words. He would say, what is unresolved in the unconscious will repeat itself in behavior. And often what we call help is merely a disguised repetition of a bond that never matured. Have you ever found yourself doing for your child what he clearly should be doing for himself? Have you felt afraid he might suffer, fail, or simply be frustrated? The human mind is cunning, and parental love, when guided by fear, becomes an emotional prison. Freud warned that the greatest mistake parents make is failing to recognize where their responsibility ends and their child's process of individuation begins. Helping too much is, more often than not, an unconscious way of staying necessary. And that, while it may feel noble, is just another face of the ego. The drama sets in slowly. It starts with a simple request, a legitimate need. Then it becomes a pattern, a cycle. The child stumbles, and the parents rush in with a cushion before he hits the ground, and deep down something in him begins to wither. His identity, his courage, his ability to face the world's pain. Freud would say that overprotection keeps the subject from passing through essential phases of pain and autonomy. He remains fixated, infantilized, emotionally unripe. And there's something even more disturbing. In many cases, the adult child plays along unconsciously. He develops what Freud called symbiotic dependence, an unconscious fusion of roles where the child doesn't feel whole without the parent's constant intervention, and the parent, unknowingly, reinforces this dynamic. An invisible thread that keeps both trapped. A love that suffocates, a bond so strong it doesn't set you free and it slowly strangles you. In this video, we will dismantle one by one the 6 situations where helping your adult child is not only a mistake, it's an act of psychological sabotage. Through Freud's lens, we'll explore why certain gestures that seem kind are actually rooted in unconscious desires for control, guilt, or fear. And by the end, you will understand how to truly protect what you love by letting go. Because true love, according to Freud, is not keeping the other close. It's allowing them to walk on their own, even if it hurts you. The human mind rarely sees where love ends and fear begins. Parents who love too much often fail to notice that their help is not love in its purest form, but a quiet, unconscious need to control. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the haunting pattern in which we unconsciously reenact unresolved emotional dramas, as if we were trying to rewrite the past through others. Helping an adult child, then, may seem like an act of kindness, but deep within, it often reflects a parent's attempt to fix their own inner wounds. Picture a son in his 30s who calls his mother before accepting any job, who seeks his father's approval before beginning any relationship. On the surface, it looks like closeness, a strong family bond. But beneath it, Freud would see regression. The child has not fully individuated, not because he lacks strength, but because the parent's emotional presence still invades every decision. The ego, his sense of self, remains tethered to those who once changed his diapers. Why do parents allow this? Because they too are trapped in the unconscious fear that if they're no longer needed, they will no longer be loved. Freud taught that true parental love must pass through a necessary grief, the grief of losing the helpless child, of accepting the distance that adulthood brings. It is only through this grief that the bond can evolve from dependence to admiration, from control to mutual respect. Yet many parents refuse this death. They keep the child close, not out of love, but out of fear of becoming irrelevant. The truth is uncomfortable. In overprotecting, a parent silently sabotages their child's ability to become the author of their own story. He remains an object, not an autonomous individual, but a psychological extension of the parent. Freud would argue that this is not love, but narcissism. We do not love the other for who they are, but for how they reflect us. We help not out of compassion, but to preserve our identity as the one who saves. And this dynamic slowly destroys both. The child grows up afraid, and the parent grows old without peace. The relationship becomes a silent prison where neither is allowed to evolve. This is why Freud insisted, a parent's task is not to protect forever, but to prepare their child to endure the world's pain with their own strength, and that requires something harder than helping. It requires letting go. There is a silent weight in every household where emotional boundaries are blurred. Freud believed that unresolved desires often disguise themselves as virtues, and in the parent-child dynamic, this is alarmingly common. A parent may say, "I'm only doing this because I care," while unconsciously seeking control, validation, or a sense of purpose. They give money, advice, shelter, not because their adult child is incapable, but because their unconscious cannot bear the anxiety of releasing them into uncertainty. They help not to empower, but to remain central. Freud would call this a transference, where one's unresolved inner need is projected onto another, masked as duty. The child, in turn, adapts to this dynamic like a patient to his analyst. He senses the hidden terms of the relationship. I will be cared for if I remain helpless. Slowly, passively, he learns to surrender initiative. He no longer strives to be independent because the emotional contract rewards dependence. The most dangerous part? Both believe they are acting out of love. But love, Freud would argue, must free the other, not tie them in invisible threads of guilt, debt, and silent expectations. This creates a psychological dependency where autonomy is feared rather than desired. The adult child feels guilt when he thrives and fear when he distances himself, and the parent, consciously unaware, becomes anxious when the child grows strong, because that strength signals loss. Freud warned that love contaminated by fear becomes possessive, and possessiveness always leads to stagnation. In these cases, maturity is postponed indefinitely, and both parties remain locked in a dynamic of emotional childhood. It is in moments of crisis that these dynamics reveal themselves most clearly. When the adult child fails, the parent steps in, not to guide, but to rescue. They provide money to cover irresponsibility, intervene in romantic disputes, or even manage consequences from career failures. Freud would interpret these acts not as compassion, but as reenactments of childhood dramas, where the parent feels powerful again and the child is returned to dependency. But this is not growth, this is regression, and regression, when prolonged, leads to internal decay. At the core of all this is a wound neither side is naming. The parent cannot tolerate absence, and the child cannot tolerate rejection. So they cling to each other, unknowingly draining one another's potential. Freud's psychoanalysis teaches us that every unresolved emotional debt becomes a behavioral pattern. And unless it is brought to the surface and confronted, it will silently direct our lives, just like a puppeteer in the shadows. Sometimes help is not a hand extended, but a chain disguised as kindness. Freud believed that the unconscious mind speaks not through words, but through patterns. A parent who constantly solves problems for an adult child may believe they are offering safety, but what they are often offering is a disguised message. I don't believe you can do this without me. This message sinks into the psyche like a hidden curse, shaping the child's self-concept. He may grow in years, but not in confidence. This erosion is not immediate. It is gradual, like water wearing down a stone. The child begins to doubt his instincts, he postpones decisions, he consults endlessly. He looks for authority figures everywhere, because he never learned to trust the authority within. Freud would say, this is the failure of ego development. The ego, the part of the mind responsible for reality, decision, and strength, becomes weak when it is never tested. And when a parent constantly steps in, the child's ego remains underdeveloped, fragile, dependent. Yet society often praises these parents. You're such a dedicated mother, they say. He's lucky to have a father like you. But Freud would caution against confusing involvement with growth. True support is not about doing for someone. It is about being a mirror, a reference point, a witness to their becoming. When a parent robs a child of failure, they also rob him of strength. There is no resilience without pain. There is no maturity without risk. And there is no true identity without separation. Some parents do not see this because they are themselves children emotionally. Their identity is enmeshed with the role of caretaker. They need someone to need them, And so they create scenarios, unconsciously, where their adult child always falls just short of success, just enough to justify intervention. Freud identified this as the return of the repressed, when hidden desires sabotage conscious intentions. "I want you to succeed," they say, "but only if your success still leaves a space for me." In this entangled love, both sides suffer. The parent carries resentment, tired, unacknowledged, quietly bitter. The child carries guilt, incapable of breaking free without feeling cruel. This is not love, Freud would insist. This is a mutual fixation, a standstill in psychological development. And unless one of them dares to break the pattern, both remain ghosts of what they could have become. In psychoanalysis, one of Freud's most powerful tools was confrontation, not with others, but with the self. The parent who dares to ask, "Why do I help so much?" begins a terrifying journey inward. They may uncover fears of loneliness, shame about their own past failures, or a hollow sense of self-worth that only fills when they're rescuing someone else. This is not weakness. This is the unconscious seeking to heal. But it cannot heal through the child. It must heal in the one who suffers. For the child, the confrontation is no less brutal. To admit that one has outgrown the need for constant help is to accept the weight of one's own decisions. There will be no one to blame, no one to run to, just the self, exposed, fallible, free. Freud would describe this as the acceptance of castration, the symbolic realization that omnipotence is gone and limitation is real. But with that comes the possibility of maturity, of building something authentic, not inherited. These awakenings are painful. They shatter illusions, they tear apart myths of eternal closeness and parental omniscience. But they are necessary. Because until the adult child sees the parent not as a god, but as a person, flawed, finite, human, no real relationship can exist. And until the parent stops seeing the child as their second chance at life, no freedom will be possible. What Freud teaches us is simple. To love well, we must let the other be real. This may mean saying no, refusing to give money, declining to solve another crisis. And that refusal will hurt. It will be called cold, cruel, even heartless. But in truth, it is the first step toward liberation. Freud believed that suffering is not always something to avoid. Sometimes it is the very gate through which we pass into growth. And refusing to help, when help perpetuates dependence, is an act of radical love. The path ahead is not clean. There will be guilt, there will be misunderstanding, but there will also be light. Because when the pattern is broken, when the parent steps back and the child steps forward, both are reborn. Not as savior and victim, but as two individuals, capable of love without control, support without suffocation, and connection without sacrifice of the self. When Freud examined the unconscious mind, he found that the greatest battles are fought not in our actions, but in the motivations we deny. A parent who insists they are just trying to help may truly believe it, but the unconscious often holds a darker truth. The help may be a way to avoid their own emptiness. The act of saving a child from struggle becomes a performance that distracts from the parent's own fears, of aging, of irrelevance, of never having resolved their own identity, and so the child becomes a mirror, reflecting not their own needs, but the parent's unresolved longing. This mirror, however, is not stable. It fractures the moment the child begins to evolve. The parent, unconsciously threatened, may then sabotage their child's progress with subtle doubts. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Or, "Don't you think it's too soon?" Freud saw this as the return of the repressed, the unacknowledged fear that love is no longer enough when it is not needed. The child, sensing this discomfort, may slow down their own development out of guilt. They dim their light to preserve the bond. Over time, this dance becomes a prison. The parent feels burdened, but cannot stop helping. The child feels suffocated, but cannot break free. Freud warned that when emotional ties are not rooted in autonomy, they become chains of mutual dependence. There is no joy, only obligation. No growth, only repetition. And repetition, in Freud's analysis, is the enemy of transformation. We become stuck in loops because we fear what freedom might reveal. But there is hope in the break. When one party, parent or child, begins to question the unconscious contract, a rupture begins. The guilt will be immense, the fear of rejection will rise, but as Freud taught, only through this confrontation with inner fear can the self be born anew. The parent learns to live without being needed. The child learns to exist without being rescued. And in that rupture, space opens for real love to grow. What once looked like betrayal is, in truth, evolution. And what once felt like abandonment becomes a new form of intimacy, one based not on dependence but on respect. Freud's greatest gift to us was not a map to avoid pain, but a method to transform it. To stop helping when help harms is to honor the other's soul. It is not the end of love, it is its highest form. The danger of unconditional help lies in its illusion. Freud taught that behind every human behavior lies a motive, conscious or not. And when help is offered again and again, even when it stunts growth, that motive must be questioned. Sometimes help is a form of control. Other times, it's a hidden form of punishment. But perhaps most dangerously, it becomes the glue that keeps unresolved trauma sealed shut, never to be examined, never to be healed. The adult child trapped in this system learns to equate safety with limitation. He does not dare take risks because the unspoken message is that failure is expected and readiness is forever postponed. Freud believed that for the ego to mature, the individual must be allowed to fail. It is through failure, not rescue, that strength is built. And it is through solitude, not dependence, that identity is born. But how can one fail if the parent always catches them before the fall? Parents often confuse love with presence, believing that being constantly available equals being good. But Freud would challenge that. True presence, he argued, is about bearing witness, not interference. It is standing firm while the other trembles, not rushing in to remove the trembling. For when we protect someone from their own storm, we also steal the rainbow they might have earned from surviving it. The shift, therefore, begins with awareness. The parent must ask, am I helping or am I afraid to let go? And the child must ask, am I receiving love or avoiding responsibility? These questions are not soft. They pierce, they disturb, but they are the only way to end the cycle, because until they are asked and answered, both will remain locked in a love that smothers rather than frees. And what comes after is not distance, but depth. A relationship where each stands whole, not half. Where the parent is admired, not depended upon, and where the child is respected, not pitied. Freud's vision of the psyche was not one of comfort. It was one of courage. And courage, in families, means knowing when to hold on and when to let go with love. There comes a moment in every life when patterns must be broken, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Freud knew that the unconscious does not yield easily. It resists, it repeats, it seduces. But when a parent dares to shift the dynamic, to say enough when the instinct screams help, they become more than a parent. They become a liberator, not of the child alone, but of themselves. And this is the silent redemption psychoanalysis offers, not perfection but transformation. For the adult child, liberation feels like exile at first. There will be moments of silence, distance, even pain. But pain is not the enemy, avoidance is. Freud insisted that the path to freedom is lined with discomfort. Only by walking through that discomfort do we access the true self, the self that is not defined by anyone else's fear, guilt, or protection. And when the child finds that self, something remarkable happens. They begin to love the parent, not from need but from choice. This new love is quieter, less dramatic, but infinitely more powerful. It is a love rooted in recognition of difference, of limits, of truth. And in that recognition both find peace. The parent no longer needs to be needed. The child no longer needs to be saved. Each becomes whole in their own right, and the relationship becomes a meeting of equals, not a reenactment of dependency. Freud believed that families are the first theater of the mind, where our deepest roles are learned, performed, and often never questioned. But when a parent says, "I will not help you this time," and the child says, "I will try on my own," the play ends, and a new one begins. One not written by fear, but by freedom. not directed by guilt, but by choice. This is the moment where love evolves into truth. And so the greatest gift you can give your child is not protection, it is belief. Belief that they can fall and rise, that they can suffer and still stand, that they can live fully, freely, fiercely, without you solving everything. Because only then, as Freud taught, do we stop being echoes of our past and finally become the authors of our future. There is a silent moment that follows every great truth, a pause where the heart catches up with the mind. If you have come this far, it means something inside you has already begun to shift. Perhaps it's a memory, a regret, or a question you never dared to ask. Freud believed that awareness is the first act of freedom, and today perhaps you saw more clearly the threads that have quietly shaped your relationship with your child. Threads woven from love, fear, guilt, and hope, beautiful but sometimes binding. The courage to stop helping when help has become harm is not a rejection of love, it is love evolving. It is the recognition that every soul must walk through its own fire. That growth cannot be gifted. That identity cannot be borrowed. Freud taught us that the greatest gift we can give another is not protection, but the space to suffer, to choose, to become. And sometimes to truly love our child is to say, I trust you to fall and to rise without me. Letting go does not mean absence. It means presence without interference. It means standing beside, not in front. It means replacing control with curiosity, watching your child struggle without panic, triumph without envy, and walk away without collapsing inside. Freud knew that maturity, for both parent and child, only arrives when we can bear the weight of separation and still remain whole. So now the question that remains is not what your child needs from you, but what kind of relationship you are willing to build from this day forward, one rooted in honesty, not performance, in boundaries, not sacrifice, in truth, not illusion. Because sometimes the most powerful sentence a parent can say is, I will love you, even when I no longer carry you. And that love, unpossessive, undemanding, unbreakable, is what finally sets both hearts free. If this message echoed in a part of you that words rarely touch, let it live beyond this screen. Share it, speak it, comment on what stirred you. Subscribe not just to this channel, but to a deeper commitment, to healing what has been repeated for far too long. Because somewhere out there, someone is still carrying what they were never meant to hold, and your voice might be the one that helps them finally put it down.